From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. Florida, Arizona, and Illinois headed to the polls to select their candidate for the Democratic primaries. Ohio was the only state scheduled to hold a primary today, which opted to postpone last minute. While citizens are chattering over coronavirus concerns, and some cities have taken major steps to try to halt the spread, states like Florida pushed ahead with smaller than usual crowds. Here's what people at the polls in Miami Beach had to say.
A lot of elderly people vote in Florida. We have a lot of elderly population in Miami-Dade and Miami Beach. And as a result, we have two issues that arise. Number one, we have a lot of elderly poll workers that we have to protect. So we've been taking extra precautions as to them. And as to our voters, there has been a reduction in turnout of our elderly population.
My country is Italy. My entire family and everyone I love is there. And the situation is very bad, but they're taking it very seriously, and I don't see the same here. I mean, here economy goes first, but eventually they will shut down when it will be too late.
I don't think the state should postpone. I know they're trying to be safe, but I think politics is constantly changing, and you sort of had to take the snapshot altogether across the country, more or less, and if everybody waits till the fall, they may change their votes, so, yeah.
Authorities in Ohio ordered the closure of all polling facilities just hours before voting was set to begin. The decision was taken after a judge denied the state governor's request to delay the primary until June to protect voters from the coronavirus.
And it's still continuing to develop, but I think we have at least some guidance now where we're going. We can take care of our employees here now that are not feeling well. We have some. We've been exposed to a lot of people here at the Board of Elections. Some employees aren't feeling well. We've got a tent set up outside here at the Board of Elections, and we are accepting curbside people to drop off their ballots at the curb. We are not voting anyone curbside, but people can drop off their ballots today until 7:30.
As markets have plummeted, the U.S. federal government has prioritized keeping the economy afloat and called the coronavirus worse than 9/11 for the airline industry.
We absolutely believe in keeping the markets open. Okay, Americans need to know they have access to their money. After September 11th, the only reason why the markets were closed was because the technology was disrupted. I've been on the phone with the major banks, with the New York Stock Exchange. Everybody wants to keep it open. We may get to a point where we shorten the hours if that's something they need to do. I think, as you know, this is worse than 9/11. For the airline industry, this is, they are almost ground to a halt. The president wants to make sure that although we don't want people to travel unless it's critical, we want to maintain for critical travel the right to have domestic travel.
All the while, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo says that the state is looking for ways to deal with hospitals' maximum capacity, as local authorities are showing desperation.
These are not normal operating conditions. We're examining the entire hospital system. What is the maximum capacity per hospital? If Department of Health waives their spatial rules, how many people can you get into hospitals? We're going back to retired staff, and we're asking them to contact us at this website, health.ny.gov/assistance, to get former nurses, former doctors to sign up to be on call. We're also going to medical schools, nursing schools, to try to get additional medical personnel. This is an extraordinary time in this nation's history. It will go down in the history books as one of those moments of true crisis and confusion and chaos.
Now with me now for some analysis is James Counts Early. He's a current board member for the Institute for Policy Studies and the former Assistant Secretary of Education and Public Service at the Smithsonian. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Now, James, start us off with your overall take on the race. We're likely seeing a low turnout today in these primaries, and Bernie Sanders is behind in the delegate race. And without the support of the Democratic establishment, what should we expect for tonight's results? Is Bernie Sanders still in it?
Well, it's right now the momentum certainly is with Joe Biden, who's leading in the delegate count and in the momentum. And it would appear at this point, unless something drastic happens, that he will go in with the majority of delegates. But this is a political process about the negotiation of who will have the authority around what national and international policy platforms to govern the nation. And millions of new progressive citizens have mobilized around Bernie Sanders, and that process predates the emergence of Bernie Sanders as a candidate in 2016. So they're not going to stop pushing for the most progressive agenda that can possibly be achieved at the Democratic nomination convention in order to defeat Donald Trump. They will not be satisfied with just the focus on just dump Trump, just vote blue, in order to go back to the restoration of the way that the Democratic Party has acted in the past, failing to come up with progressive policies. So this is going to be an ongoing battle that the citizens will push. Bernie Sanders will have a lot of pressure on him to get out of the race, and he will have to make an independent decision. But by no means do I expect that he will abandon his policy platform, nor will he abandon his connection to the millions of voters who are pushing that platform. I think he will renounce that this is not a Bernie Sanders movement. This is a progressive citizens movement. And his slogan all along has been about us, not about me. So that I expect that the politics of this will continue. We'll see what the individual candidate Bernie Sanders does.
Okay, so let's discuss the coronavirus because that's what's topping the news. What do you make of the political and economic response there in the United States so far by authorities?
Well, the two issues are connected. Clearly, the crisis, the global pandemic of the coronavirus, and the almost intentional unpreparedness of the United States government that does not have universal health care, that does not educate enough nurses and doctors, that prioritizes the airlines and other big corporations over the needs of everyday peoples, reveals an ethical crisis in the midst of a dangerous health crisis. The most vulnerable people will be hit as usual. The 500,000 homeless people, about 70% of them African Americans, who are living on the streets, will be among those most vulnerable. The largest prison population in the world, significantly Black and Latino, who don't have adequate health attention, will be victims of that. And we see a paralyzed federal government trying to play politics with major priority on what is happening to major corporations rather than putting money in the hands of ordinary people who are the real economy. The real economy is not the rising or the falling stock market, because the great majority of citizens don't have stock, but they don't have employment, and they need income in order to be able to consume, to purchase. That is the essential nature of the economy. And as you can see, this Congress is paralyzed on the one hand with the Democratic Party doing too little to push a stimulus that would go directly to ordinary citizens. And on the other hand, the Republican Party blocking, holding up the process in order to put money into the hands of corporations. So we have a serious crisis, a systemic crisis here, as economics is reflected in the political action.
Now, James, you're the best person to speak to on Cuba. Can you tell us about the Cuban government's response so far and how that might contrast with the approaches we've seen elsewhere, and also their exports of medicine and doctors throughout the world?
Well, the Cubans are ironically leading on this planet of 7 billion people. The country of 11 million people has unfolded a medical product in China that will not prevent the coronavirus, but that treats it effectively. Even Brazil, who recently, under the authoritarian government of Bolsonaro, expelled thousands of Cuban doctors from the hinterlands of Brazil, where they were serving patients in many instances who had never had medical attention, is now asking for Cuban doctors to come back. The Italians are asking for Cuban medical personnel. And this is just an expression of the humanity, the solidarity humanity of the Cubans and their will, despite much natural resources are a significant economy, to focus on the humanistic concerns of life and to share that with the world. As the listening and viewing audience sees, they recently admitted a ship of passengers that no one else would admit of tourists who were suffering with the coronavirus and giving them treatment. So one of the questions before the United States government and before the likes of Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders is let us turn to the people, the World Health Organization, the Cubans and others who have advanced protocols and advanced medical products to help treat this pandemic and let the lies stop about what the nature of Cuba is. Cuba has been raised in the context of the Democratic primaries and now emerges in the context of this pandemic crisis as being a flagship of hopefulness and possibilities, practically speaking, not the political diversion as we see Donald Trump gather every morning these politicians who are overriding the medical staff, talking about plans, but producing nothing. We are not testing in the United States, very little. We don't have sufficient hospital beds. To producing those things rather than the rhetoric that is going on. So this is a context in which we should applaud Cuba and we should fight this blockade so that we can have access to the other medical products that the Cubans are quite willing to share here in the United States, their anti-cancer medicines, one of which is being legally tested in a Boston laboratory today. But Cuba steps forward again and reveals that there is much that the world can contribute, can benefit from what the Cubans have to offer and are willing to offer.
And on that note, and follow up to that, as far as the decades-long U.S. blockade on Cuba and the sanctions, the unilateral coercive measures on countries like Venezuela and Iran, who are also battling the coronavirus, do you think, what are the different prospects given these two candidates, Biden and Bernie Sanders, on the case of lifting the blockade? How will, in any way, their policies be any different from Trump's policies towards Cuba?
Well, certainly if Bernie Sanders were to emerge as a presidential candidate, or even if he is not and he continues in the Senate, I anticipate that he will be very open to going back to the Obama-Raul Castro normalization of relations agreement. But this is a sad commentary on the ethical downfall of both the Republican and the Democratic Party, particularly the Republican Party with Pompeo at the State Department in this very inhumane health war, if you will, against Venezuela, preventing them from getting access to drugs to fight this virus. And the stupidity and the injurious developments that come out of that, not only for the United States population, for the global population, of having this inhumane blockade war, this economic war against the Cubans, and refusing to see, as Bernie Sanders courageously said, we should deal with facts as facts. And the Cubans do have a very well-developed health system, which made major contributions against the Ebola and SARS outbreak, and who are now making a contribution against this virus. And we should look to develop relations to have benefit from that and to establish a normal relation with Cuba. But I'm not I don't think that this will occur in any time soon. The United States population will continue to have to push for that, and the global population has repeatedly stood against this blockade, and they must do so even now more because the Cubans are offering this great productive benefit to fight this coronavirus.
Okay, James, let's talk about Biden's comments on picking the first woman vice president. You said, don't be fooled by the identity, diversity, political agendas, which refuse to address an actual progressive agenda. Tell us more.
Well, this is a major rhetorical step forward to admit that there has been a historical and contemporary discrimination against meritorious women who bring a capacity to run government. That is not a disputable fact, but it has been the male chauvinism and the bias generally in the national community, which has been a roadblock to women having access. But let's not be fooled by simply saying a woman, a Black, a queer person. What is the ideological and policy platform for national policy would bring? What would be their position on universal health care? What will be their position on stopping the military industrial complex and the prison complex? What would be their position on standing shoulder and hand in the battle of the Palestinians for self determination and the fight for human rights? These are the policy questions, not the abstract identity questions. What is the difference between Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren ideologically and politically? There is a great difference, but Biden refuses to address that. Bernie Sanders indicated that yes, he would stand forth and select a woman as well, but the primary question is what outlook and what policy platform would this woman be articulating, not just what the social category is. And Biden evades that issue.
So given what you've just said, how would you respond to these Bernie bro comments in the mainstream cable news and also other mainstream media that say that the Sanders campaign doesn't actually represent these different groups, which are Black Americans, women, and others?
Well, on the Bernie bro question, that has been disputed and verified by a Harvard University study of, I think, 6,000 or 6 million tweets or something of that sort, to say that no such concept of the Bernie brothers exists. But let's just set that aside for the moment. It is absolutely true by statistical indication of who has voted and in what demographics that the Bernie Sanders movement and the citizen movement representing Bernie Sanders has failed to make the kinds of inroads into the African American community that they had hoped to make. That is just a statistical fact. There's a generational divide or distinction between younger African Americans and older African Americans. Younger African Americans voting for the progressive agenda and the progressive candidate. Older African Americans voting for the more conservative candidate in Joe Biden. However, many of the interviews with them indicate that they identify with some of the key elements of the progressive agenda, particularly universal health care. So there is much work to be done within the progressive community, political education to get people to understand what platforms are in their interest, what policy platforms serve their needs and aspirations, rather than to focus on personality politics, which is the basic narrative of this white man or that Latina woman, rather than looking again, it's what is their outlook, what are their policies, and what are their dispositions to struggle against a system that is paralyzed both in the Democratic Party establishment and in the Republican Party authoritarian establishment. It is not enough just to defeat Trump, but defeat Trump with what? With a progressive platform. Because on the other side of defeating Trump is also the institutionalization of Trump-like policies and an authoritarian Republican Party that may not have the extreme personality leadership that Trump represents, but is going to be another battleground. And this is what Joe Biden and the Democratic Party establishment refuses to talk about. Joe Biden wants to reach across the aisle of a mythical past with the now deceased John McCain's, but nothing got done. When we look at Congressman Claiborne's district in South Carolina, the African American, who's the third member in the leadership of the Democratic Party, 7 of the 9 poorest districts in South Carolina are his districts. So there's a lot of rhetoric, and citizens need to understand that this is about policy, not about personality.
Thank you so much for being on with us once again. James Counts Early. He is the current member of the Institute for Policy Studies. Glad to have you on once again and hope to have you again to talk about Cuba.
Thank you very much.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute.